There are more stars in the universe than there are atoms in our atmosphere. Each is a cog in the system that is our climate. Without knowing their initial position, momentum, and the various forces acting upon them, making accurate long-term weather forecasts is futile. Similar to our climate, the stock market is a dynamic, chaotic system where making market price predictions seems rather impossible. But what if we could understand these systems enough to make long-term predictions, enough to anticipate market price fluctuations and to forecast natural disasters? This was the mentality that I had going into this project. The question I began asking myself was, what causes stock prices to fluctuate? And I began by looking at the fundamentals of the stock market. And what I found is there are two core ideas. The first is demand drives the market price. And the second is that the true perceived security value drives demand. Now let's dig into this first one a little bit. So here we have a supply and demand chart where supply, the blue line, represents the number of shareholders willing to sell their shares at a given price. Now as this price goes up, more people are willing to sell their shares. And the red line represents demand, the number of people willing to buy shares at a given price. Now, as you can imagine, as the price goes up, the number of people willing to buy shares goes down. Now, I want to direct your attention to the most critical point on this chart, the equilibrium point, the point where these two lines intersect. And what this represents is the market price. So what's going on here is there's this sort of background discussion, behind-the-scenes discussion, between the interested parties and the shareholders, where they're trying to decide on a fair price. And ultimately, this is the compromise, the market price, which is what you hear when people are saying Tesla's going for 400 right now. It's also known as the price per share. Now let's say that something of value happens to this initial stock. What happens is it raises investor sentiment, meaning more investors are willing to buy shares of a stock, and this ultimately raises demand. Now look at what happens when our red demand line rises. Look at what happens to that intersection point. It rises as well. And what that indicates to us is as demand rises, so does the market price. So theoretically, we could derive that demand drives the market price. So it's intuitive to ask ourselves, well, what drives demand? And so for this, I looked at the core investment idea, to buy low and sell high in order to maximize profits. Now you all are probably thinking like, okay, well, duh, how does this help us? And so instead of looking at this idea, I looked at how investors are utilizing this idea. How do they know when to buy and when the price has peaked and it's going to start going back down? And what it comes down to is two key values. The market price, the price per share, the intersection between those two lines that we discussed earlier, and as well the security value. Now the security value is the value of a company divided by the number of shares of this company. So for example, if we have Apple, let's say Apple's worth $20,000, and we all know Apple's worth much more, but bear with me. Apple's worth $20,000 and they have 1,000 shares available to investors. So what we do is we divide this 20,000 by the 1,000 and we get a security value of $20. Now it's important to note that it's the perceived value of the company. It's not the actual value of Apple, it's what I as an investor believe Apple is worth. So it's more accurate to refer to this as the perceived security value. Now let's look at these two values in action. What we have here is our market price, and here is our calculated security value. Now there's an obvious gap between the two values, and what this indicates to us is an undervaluation. The market price is below the actual value of the company. And so what I, as an investor, am going to do is I'm going to say, okay, well this is a bargain, and I'm going to buy in. And when I do that, I'm making two assumptions. The first assumption is that the market price is going to rise up towards that perceived security value. And the second assumption is that it's going to rise because other investors, a majority of other investors, are going to as well see this as an undervaluation and buy as well. And that's going to increase demand. And as we know, when demand increases, it drives that market price up. Now I touched on a key aspect here, and that is that majority matters. What I think doesn't matter, what the majority of investors thinks matters. So if I think a stock is undervalued and I buy and I'm expecting that price to go up, it doesn't matter unless the rest of the investors think that stock is undervalued and they think that price is going to go up. Because if they think if it's overvalued, that means they're going to start selling shares. So all of a sudden I'm sitting here waiting for my money to be made and the stock price is lowering. So this leads me to a key idea here, which is the true perceived security value, the perceived security value in the eyes of the majority, not the individual, is what allows us to make accurate market price predictions, right? Because if we know the security value, we know which way the market price is going to fluctuate. So it's intuitive to now ask, well, where do we find this true perceived security value? And so while I was in my research, I was thinking about this, and I was like, well, if I take all of the individual security values, maybe we can find the true perceived value within that. So I started to look at how individual investors calculated their own individual perceived security values. And more or less what these investors do is they take all sorts of factors, may it be the revenue that month or the increase in revenue or whatever else, price per share, any of that, and they put it into this mathematical model. And as they put these factors in, they're all weighted differently. And then this model spits out their perceived security value, which is what they then use to make investment decisions. So I was thinking, okay, well, if that's what happens for one investor and that's what happens for all investors, except they use different models, what if we combine all those models to make one monster model that produces the true perceived security value? And so I started researching all the different models and values and factors that people are utilizing, and I found that what I was trying to do was impossible. Okay? There are so many millions of factors and millions of ways to weight these factors that to combine both of these into one mathematical model that accounts for all of it is impossible, not to mention the fact that these values are constantly changing. And so at this point in my project, I was like, okay, well, the question I'm asking is impossible. I should give up and move on to something else. I need to change my question. And I remember sitting in the car trying to think about what my new senior project could be about. And I turned on the radio and I remember hearing this lady, this NPR lady, talking about emergent intelligence. And what she was discussing was there's this hive of bees. And this hive of bees needs to find a new home. So what they do is they send out hundreds of little search bees. And these bees go out in about a 30-mile radius from the hive, and they try to find the perfect home. And there's a lot that goes into this home, right? It needs to be protected from weather and rain. It needs to be close to clean water, but not in a damp environment. It needs to be close to pollen. It needs to be ventilated enough to stay cool in summer, but insulated enough to stay warm in the winter. And so all these bees are going out and they're searching for this ideal home. And then they return back to their original hive and they have this elevated sort of discussion between each other where they're all vibrating and communicating at this higher biological level. And what happens is as they do this, they land on this optimal decision. So 80% of the time when bees are searching for their new homes, they find the perfect home out of all these tons of different options. And so I started researching emergent intelligence because it piqued my interest. I found two parts. The first is wisdom of crowds, which is the human equivalent to what the bees were doing. And the second is swarm intelligence, which is the biological word that describes what the bees were doing. So the best known example of wisdom of crowds is guessing the number of beans in a jar. So we're all at the fair and we're all guessing how many beans are in this jar, because if we guess the exact number, they'll give us a prize, they'll give us $100. And we find that almost no individual can guess the exact number of jelly beans in this jar. It's statistically unlikely. But what happens is when we average all of the guesses of the individuals, we find that it's remarkably close to the actual number of jelly beans in the jar. And so this was really interesting, and I started to look in swarm intelligence, which, like I discussed, was a biological ability of certain creatures to communicate at a higher biological level in order to make these decisions, these optimal decisions. And so ants do this through pheromones, bees and fish do this through vibrations, birds do this through emergent behaviors through the flock, And what we find, like what we found with the bees, is that they have optimal intelligence. This emergent super intelligence appears out of these conversations. And so the key difference here between the wisdom of crowds, what humans are doing, and the swarm intelligence, what the animals are doing, is isolation versus collaboration. So when I'm guessing the number of jelly beans in a jar, I'm guessing in isolation without the context of what everybody else thinks. But when the bees are finding a new home, they're working together in a group to find this optimal answer. And so this man started looking into this, and he developed Unanimous AI, which is a company that allows humans to swarm. They developed a technological interface that allows humans to swarm. So what we see here is the screen that people who are swarming see. And we have this center little ball, and that represents the equilibrium of opinion, the balanced sort of conclusion of all parties. And then these magnets on the outside are the participant guesses. And what you can do as a participant is change the size and the location of your magnet. And as you do that, it changes the magnitude of your guess on the center puck, and it as well changes the direction that it's moving. So we can look at it here in action. So more or less what's happening is people are moving, and as they can see what other participants are guessing, they can adjust their own guess. They're collaborating to land on this optimal conclusion. And so I know you all are thinking, well, that's really cool, Izzy, but what does that have to do with the stock market? And I was thinking the same thing, right? Because I had done all this research on the stock market, and I didn't want to just throw that away, so my stubborn teenage mind was trying to mush the two together until it clicked, right? The stock market itself is a swarm intelligence interface. Right? When the market price is moving up and down, it's not doing so randomly. It's not happening out of chaos. It's happening because investors are pulling this market price back and forth. They're converging and having this dynamic discussion on what the true perceived security value is. And we know this because if we have our true perceived security value here, and we have the market price below it, it's going to be identified as an undervaluation. People are going to buy. It's going to drive the price back up. Or if the market price is above the true perceived value, people are going to see it as an overvaluation and sell, and that drives the market price back down. So if we understand this, what we see is it's all coming back to the true perceived security value. So what does this mean? What am I proposing? Well, first, if what I'm saying is true, we can make accurate predictions on stock market fluctuations. And second is we're pulling something chaotic and bringing order to it. We're taking something seemingly random and chaotic, and we're looking at the fundamental structure, and then we're relating the fundamental structure to a biological phenomenon and giving it order. Pretty cool.
Yeah.
So why else do I think this is cool? Well, it took bees millions of years to develop this ability through survival means and evolution. And we as humans have developed this interface, this giant system that governs a lot or has a lot to do with our economics in this country. And we've done it without even knowing. This pattern is emerging in this system that we're so highly dependent on, and it's fascinating. And I want to leave you with one final idea. The stock market is a self-fulfilling prophecy, as we've established, where if a majority of investors think that a stock price is overvalued and they start selling, that stock price is going to go down whether it was overvalued or not. And so what happens is if people have access to this TPSV, this true perceived security value, and they start making investment decisions based on this true perceived security value instead of on their individual perceived security values, that fundamental idea, that second fundamental idea breaks. And when it breaks the logical progression that allowed us to understand the stock market as a swarm intelligence. And so what I'm saying here is this theory only works if no one knows it exists. Thank you.